Good afternoon. Now, if you thought Brian's accent was bad, wait till you hear me. Brian's a good friend of mine from Northern Ireland. I'm from Scotland, and he's taller than me, but I'm proud of one thing. I've got a wee bit more hair than him, but it's really marginal. You know, it's going to be clear we're getting closer as the days go by. Now, I'm going to give you this 2,500 years of learning theory in 25 minutes. This is going to be at breakneck speed, really. But were you at the plenary session this morning when the neuroscientist asked the whole audience, do you think that we only use 10% of the brains? Do you believe in DAK learning styles? Do you think left-right brain theory is right? And there was a forest of arms went around me, and I went, what the hell? Does anybody read any learning theory in our world? It's absolutely astonishing. It is astonishing. Imagine hiring an engineer to build a bridge and they don't know any physics. Are we really accepting that position in our profession? Because that's maybe where we are. It's totally and utterly bizarre that we shouldn't know the heroes of our profession, the people who shaped our world. So hopefully I can give you some idea how they shape the world. One thing I'm going to say is I've written a lot of detail about every one of the 101 people I'm going to talk about today, and it's all in a book, and if you give me your email address, I'll send you a PDF of that book. I'm not going to be able to do everything in 25 minutes, okay? So it's going to be a critical study, the good, the bad, and the downright ugly, folks, because there's a lot of bad stuff in here as well, okay? So this is 100, I don't know if you recognize many of them, you may recognize a handful, but let's start with the good old Greeks here. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Interesting beginning because they still have a massive influence on our educational system. Remember that Plato had an academy, the first university really. It went for 900 years. That was a long time before Justinian closed it down. Aristotle, man of science, an empiricist, so we have man of reason versus man of science. Academic versus vocational, still alive and kicking in our system, still a big problem. And then people like Euclid, who gave us the first algorithm. Did you listen to the AI guy this morning? Pythagoras. We had a big burst of mathematics from the Greeks, which is alive and kicking with PISA and other things today. I think the maths Taliban may have been getting a bit too far these days, forcing mathematics down the throats of every child until they're 18. I'm not too sure about the wisdom of that. And then this one at the bottom here, Socrates, the guy who seems to have been forgotten a little bit. Now, this is Raphael's School of Athens here. I'll jump down a little bit to show you this. There's a great piece of art here, and he really sums it up. We have Plato here with his hand pointing up, that sort of theoretical, cosmological view of the world, man of reason. Aristotle with his hand outwards, pointing towards the earth, the empirical view of the world, a man who gave us that notion of the rounded Greek vision of education, mind and body. And then we have Euclid over here with his compasses, and Pythagoras over here as well. So Raphael is trying to tell us something here, which is these people mattered, and they do. But notice, where is Socrates? Where is Socrates in this? He's not in the middle. He's way over here. Because Socrates wouldn't have a damn thing to do with these guys, really. Plato wrote almost everything we know about Socrates, but Socrates is over there talking to people. He isn't standing there. He's talking to people. He's engaged in conversation and dialogue, something that we do so rarely now in education. So let's move on, and we'll talk about these religious leaders, in a sense, which, again, people underplay this, but don't underestimate the influence of Confucius, for example, in the Far East, if you've ever taught in China, Malaysia, Thailand, or those other countries, less so Thailand, it's more Buddhist. You will know that the culture is different there in terms of attitudes to education, much more collective, much more orientated towards society in general. It did actually lead to these massive exams, which Confucius started, which are alive and kicking in China today. Literally millions of people take the same exam on the same day, a Confucian thing. Then we have the Buddha list. I thought Buddha had no influence in educational theory whatsoever until this stupid mindfulness thing came into our world. I thought, Jesus Christ. Oh, wrong phrase, sorry. I thought, wow. You know, can't we lay any of these fads to rest? Do we have to believe every little fad that hits our desks? Jesus, of course, has had an astounding influence on our world, mainly because we look down on the left-hand side here, this image from one of the first universities in Europe from Bologna, the notion of the sermon. Preaching is teaching. That, believe me, is what everybody in almost every university on the planet still does, and it's a disgrace. Let me end on that one. We still have the lectern, the thing you stand behind to preach, Isn't that weird that we have that sort of furniture in the educational world? Right out the church. Okay? And then we have Muhammad. And remember, don't think that is not alive and kicking in the educational system. The Quran literally means recitation. It means to recite. It means to memorize. And that's the type of education that we don't necessarily want, but it has some virtues. Don't write this stuff off. But let's not imagine that massive religious influences on our educational system are here, and it's damn dangerous. I have a profound belief that education should be secular. It annoys the hell out of me to see religion being taught in schools. And look at the consequences in Paris. Look at the consequences of this, and think again if you think that religious education should have a major role in closing young minds down, because that's what it does. It doesn't open them up. Most people adopt the religious posture of their parents and teachers. We have to open young children's minds up, not close them down. Okay? Next group, interesting, the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, we have St. Augustine, who basically took Plato and turned it into Christianity. Again, that theoretical view of the world. Really interesting couple of Arab scholars here, in terms of Ghazali and Ibn Tafal, who wrote really sensitive works on teaching and moral purpose and the natural notion of learning amongst learners. Completely ignored, of course, in our tradition, but nevertheless, they actually passed on that Greek tradition to us. Remember, without these people, we would have none of that stuff. And then we have Ignatius, give me the child at 8, and I'll hand you the man. Throughout Southern Europe, South America, the Catholic Church is still there, right in every school. I don't think it's a good thing. You may think it is. I do not think it is. In Northern Ireland, in Scotland, places that I grew up in, we saw war in my lifetime because of these disputes. Then we have Luther. Luther comes along in the Reformation on the back of the printing press, remember. This is something that really did happen. We have this, we have Luther, and then we have Calvin. Now, this was a religious imperative. Luther didn't believe in secular schooling, although he wanted universal schooling. Calvin comes along and says, no, I don't know about this. I think the secular aspect of schooling might be a good thing. Calvin had an enormous influence on our schooling systems. Illich thought that the entire Anglo-Saxon schooling system was really Calvinist in its basis. But what we got in practice was still this teaching is preaching. You know, with Calvin and Luther, the schools were still a transmission notion of knowledge. Scripture was still important, and that's what we got. Someone standing behind a lecture and talking at people, occasionally saying, hands up anyone? Hands up anyone? And all the smart kids put their hands up because they know the answer already, while you abandon all the other kids in the class who don't know the answer. That's how stupid some of this is. Okay? Then a wonderful thing happened, the Enlightenment. Okay? We suddenly have a bunch of people on the back of this centuries worth of printing coming to us with fresh ideas on learners and teaching and education. Locke, with the ideas of motivation and habit, looking inside the mind of a learner, as opposed to just regarding it as a transmission of scripture notion. Then Rousseau. I'm not so sure about Rousseau. What you may not know about Rousseau, wonderful book, though Emile, the novel, is on education, is that he had 5 children and handed them all over at birth to orphanages. I'm not too sure I'm going to listen to somebody with that sort of behavioral trait in terms of their educational policy. But we do. Rousseau is alive and kicking in the hideous experiments such as Hole in the Wall, the idea that kids are just naturally going to learn without the help of teachers. We just shove a hole in the wall, put a computer in it, and every poor child in the world will go to Harvard. That is bullshit. But that comes directly from Rousseau. This is the first woman on the list here, Wollstonecraft. Great book on education. Starting to look at the role of gender in education and women's role in education. I have hardly any women on my slides. Why is that? Because women were excluded from professional education, well, by and large, till the early 20th century. They had no role to play. They were absolutely excluded from the process. That was tragic, but it was a truth. At least we had one mind, and several others working at that time to think about that problem as a problem. And then Edgeworth, who gave us, really, this is more England than the rest of Europe, but gave us some wonderful stuff on practical education, a lesson that we have ignored. We are still downplaying vocational education in Europe, Africa, and the rest of the world at the expense of academic education, and I think that's a mistake. It needs to be rebalanced. And then this last guy, you'll never have heard of him, is a Scotsman called Pillins, and he invented the blackboard. Wow, what a mistake that was. You know, we did invent the telephone and the television, I'm quite proud of that one. But the blackboard, so suddenly teachers started doing this, you know, turning their back on the audience, writing things up, start broadcasting rubbish that you're never going to remember, and it's still alive and kicking today. Do any maths and physics course in any university, and you'll spend 3 or 4 years with guys who can barely look at you in the eye drawing up on a blackboard. Sometimes 3 blackboards. Where did that come from? It came from bad technology and learning. Remember, technology's been around, that's just a bad example. And we're still doing it, flip charts. I'm doing it now with PowerPoint, projectors, death by PowerPoint, even smart boards. You know, all those kids in the classroom, the teachers can barely use the functionality, 30 kids dying to lean forward and sort it out for them. A big mismatch, you know, between what actually happens in classrooms and what you're capable of. Then, a peculiar episode in world history, the Marxists. Marx comes along, he wrote very little about education, but he did say one devastatingly bad thing, which was that all knowledge is socially constructed. This, I think, is an evil, a mistake, and it's alive and kicking at this conference today in those who think the Vygotsky and social constructivism is a valid premise for teaching. I think it's not. We have Gramsci. Interestingly, the later Marxists said some really interesting things about the role of the state. You know, the state trying to impose its view upon education and educators. That's a mistake. We need to keep education autonomous and separate from the state. We have Gramsci, who was in prison, wrote a wonderful set of diaries, accusing the educational system of really playing out the ruling class's view of knowledge and so on. I think there's a certain truth in that. Same with Althusser, this notion of ISAs, which are ideological state apparatuses, and he thought that schools were #1 on his list. He thought that's where we really indoctrinate kids. And I've got this interesting thing at the bottom here. Habermas, of course, ideology and education, great stuff to read. Chomsky I've put under the Marxists because he is a pure Marxist. Everything he writes on education is the state is basically screwing our kids up. You know, by charging fees for university, you're making them go lockstep into the profession, so on and so forth. So I've included him here, although he wouldn't call himself a Marxist, but his theory is similar to them. And then then things, and remember, one other thing about Marxism. You know, I was in Cambodia recently. Now, there's an aspect of Marx that really was an evil in education, and that was something he took from Hegel, which was dialectical thinking. Dialectical thinking led to class war. It meant that Stalin actually opposed 2 classes and wiped out 2 classes, wiped out millions of people. Mao Zedong took it up and killed almost every teacher and university lecturer in China in the 1960s. It went to Pol Pot, and Pol Pot decimated, killed every single teacher in the country. I was in Cambodia last year, and they're still recovering from that. Don't imagine that Marxism played out a great role here. It led in 1975 to the massacre of millions of people and the killing of people in our profession. And that had to come to an end. In this city in 1989, of course, it absolutely did come to an end when the war. Remember, this is really close, this stuff. It was here in 1989, just a few steps from here. Then we have the constructivists. One of the unfortunate things about Marxism is it leaked out into Piaget. Piaget, the worst scientist in the world, truly and magnificently awful. He kept asking his kids, how would you use your kids in a scientific experiment? Several questions until they got the right answer. Truly awful research. Of course, subsequent research in Piaget shows that everything he wrote was completely and utterly wrong. Yet, how many times have I heard people quote Piaget back at me? And I say, haven't you read any of the literature since then that showed that everything he did, his 4 stages, were absolute rubbish? They don't really exist. Those ages are far too rigid. It's much more complicated than he ever would suggest. And then we have Vygotsky. And Vygotsky is a really sophisticated writer, but I have met very few people who have read Vygotsky. People quote social constructivism to me all the time, and my question is, which book have you read? Have you read Mind and Society? No, not really. Nobody reads this stuff. But what we do is start quoting zones of proximal development. I think a banal theory that every mother knows. I think mediation. The reason the teaching profession loved Vygotsky is he says teachers are a necessary condition for learning. That's why you like him. That's why you like him. And teaching isn't a necessary condition for learning. I haven't had a teacher for 30 years. It's not to say I haven't learned anything, okay? Then we have Brunner. I have some time for Brunner because his scaffolding and constructivist thing was very practical, built around how you design learning in a way that makes it work sensitive to the learner's background and so on. Okay? Then we have the psychoanalysis. It all went to pot again with psychoanalysis, really. The bottom line is that almost nothing has survived from Freud. Almost nothing. Read the critiques of Freud. You know? This list here, from Freudian slips to infantile sexuality, Oedipus complex, now sublimation, it's all gone. It didn't make any sense. He overstepped the mark. It wasn't scientific. It doesn't work. Okay? Other people there on the psychoanalytic side, the big name here is Rogers, Carl Rogers. He really took it into education, that notion that we should all be counselors, that we should all be sensitive to the emotional welfare of other human beings. I'm sorry, but I don't really buy that. I'm not too sure that teachers can do everything in the world, including being social workers. When I ran companies, I used to hate it when HR people used to say, no, I'm in charge of the emotional side of our employees as well. No, you're not. You're just an ordinary HR person. Leave them alone. This is why mindfulness and this sort of nonsense creeps in. You suddenly think you're responsible for the emotional development of people, that they're ill on the day they join you at the workplace. A dysfunctional view that everybody has sort of got some weird mental problem that has to be solved by HR. Jesus. And then Bandler. Bandler, a guy who shot his girlfriend through the head with a Colt revolver in the presence of his coke dealer. Nice guy. And turned into a Ponzi scheme. Thousands of people today are running NLP courses because they're NLP practitioners. They know nothing about neuroscience. They know nothing about language. They know nothing about programming. A complete and utter waste of time. Slipping hypnotherapy into the learning theory. Okay? Have a look at some NLP. Type in NLP in Google, and you will find sites that teach young men how to hypnotize girls and sleep with them in bars. That's like one short of rape. This is how stupid this stuff is. We should not be playing around with people's minds in this way and calling it training. Okay? Then we have the... I'm going to make sure I don't miss anybody here. Yeah, that's right, schoolers. This I liked. We have Montessori in Italy playing with the concept of a school, coming up with some great things. Unfortunately, it turned into a really rigid set of methods and materials. Never really took off because it remains too loyal to Montessori, I think, in terms of the methods and books. Steiner, who was a weirdo, basically, a whole lot of mysticism and eurythmics and all sorts of things. And that was the problem with Steiner schools as well. And I like these schools. I don't mind parents sending their kids to these schools. I think some of that diversity is a great thing. But Steiner can be a bit weird in terms of its philosophical basis. And then we have activists like Freire who try to redefine education entirely in terms of autonomous thinking. I really believe this, that we should be teaching people to be autonomous human beings. That's my goal as a teacher. I don't want you to think like me. I want you to think for yourself. And I think he was a great activist for that. Then two names you will never have heard of. Colbert and Burt. How many people have heard of Colbert and Burt? Wrong one. Colbert is actually a woman in this case. Now, Colbert comes from Columbia and won the Wise Prize recently for the work she's done in Colombian schools and do a schooler process. And Burt went into the jungles of Paraguay and built farm schools, created businesses at schools where kids had no education. I think maybe we're too Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-centric European in our views of educational policy and thinking, and we should tap into these people because they do some wonderful practical things that we can learn from. I recommend looking those guys up. Then from the States, interesting stuff, the pragmatists. That's the thing about Americans. They do things. I love America. I've studied there, I've lived there, I've worked there, and I admire that get up and go stuff, you know? It sometimes pisses me off being in Europe with that sort of, everybody wants to criticize. You know, every time I hear the word MOOC at this conference, there's three people hammering it into the ground like a tent peg, you know? What's wrong? You know, let's move on. Let's be optimistic about some of the things that are happening, without destroying everything on day one. We have James, the father of modern psychology, really giving us this, in a sense, a scientific method around psychology so that we really could study what learning was. And he placed a great emphasis on habit, something we've lost a little bit. There's been lots of recent research on habit, which is, you know, getting the learning habit into your students and pupils. Dewey, of course, gave us this vision of being a citizen, part of the democratic environment in which you teach. I have some problems with that as well. You know, are we really... I remember when I went to university in America and I was in a politics class. This is an Ivy League college, these top A grade students. And every one of them believed, and they told me, that anyone in America could be president. And I was a European, I goes, that's bullshit. You know, and what have we had? Clinton, Clinton, Bush, Bush, Bush. It's clearly ridiculous. But sometimes the optimism can go too far. Shank, however, read Roger Shank. He has been a huge influence in my life. Roger's a real skeptic, but very positive, doing things in real universities, a real serious academic who points to the fact that we do far too much academic teaching and not enough practical stuff. If you're going to teach business, you know, I would recommend that nobody goes to business school. I've run businesses all my life. The worst place to learn how to run a business is business school. Why? Because running a business is about running a business. And you bring in the theory as you run the business. You don't spend 3 years buggering about, doing nothing, coming out, knowing what a spreadsheet and a balance sheet is, and going in and starting a business. It's not the way things are. It's much more complicated than this, and people like Roger have pointed this out to some of the wasteful side of higher education, too theoretical. Okay? Then, again, the behaviorists. I like the scientific method. I'll come on to it in a minute. But then, for some reason out in the States, we got Skinner. Rats, conditional, you know, a whole stimulus response thing. Let's put that to one side. You know what it is. But it's not alive and dead. All these guys here talking about gamification. Oh, wouldn't it be great if we chased after rubies in this game about philosophy? No. I don't want any of that Pavlovian stuff in e-learning. I don't want any of that treating me like a child. Pac-Man games when I'm trying to learn something in healthcare. No. There are some good things in games, but it's not the Pavlovian side. Thorndike comes along, gives us experimental rigor, and marvelously points towards transfer. This big problem. When you teach someone, does it transfer to the real world? And what he says, of course, is you have to be really careful with this. You have to make sure that what you teach maps onto what they're going to do. We hardly ever do this, of course, which is why we still teach Latin in schools in Europe. Why the hell would you teach a dead language to anyone? That is stupid. And this idea that helps you learn Spanish, French, and Italian, no, that's like going over the top of your head to scratch your ear. Just go ahead and learn Spanish without Latin. Jesus, you know? Latin teachers, why? Okay? Then we have Bandura, a more interesting side to behaviorism on aggression and so on. This is good stuff, okay? Okay, let's move on. This is where it really gets interesting for me, where I bring out my prop, which is the brain. Because at last, we have some people who are interested in this, because this is what we do for a living. This is the one organ. You're not interested in people's livers or lungs. You're interested in whether you can get cognitive improvement on this thing. The most complex thing in the universe that we know of, and that's what you do. You make this better. That's all you do for a living. Okay? And that's what these guys focused on. So we have Ebbinghaus. The forgetting curve, you will forget almost everything I've just told you. That is science, guys. Everything, almost everything. That's why I'm going to send you the book afterwards if you want. That is a fact. Almost everything you teach to your kids, they will forget. 1885, we knew this. A century and a half later, we do absolutely nothing about it. And he recommended space practice. Lifting them up, repeated practice over time, he recommended it. Do we do anything? No, we do nothing. It's an appalling betrayal of the theory in our profession that we do nothing about that. Then we have Chongqing. Now, Miller said the famous paper 7 plus and minus 2 that turned out to be wrong, but he had a point. So if you don't chunk your material down, which is why the 1 hour lecture in the university is such a stupid pedagogic technique, it's like giving people this. You actually have to chunk material down to this to make it meaningful and in order to let people remember stuff. And by chunking, I don't mean just once, I mean repeatedly in space practice. There are many, many sophisticated things one can do here. Okay, because cognitive overload, what you're probably suffering from right now, too much, forgotten it all, is the great disease in education. We just don't pay enough attention to it. I've been in classes with young teachers who just go at a million miles. I've only got 25 minutes, but they go at a million miles an hour. The kids are lost. When you get older, you slow down, you learn how to teach properly. It's all about that, okay? It's all about avoiding cognitive overload. And chunking things out so that they're meaningful. Then we have Schifrin comes along, and we have this 3 model of memory, really enlightening theory here. You have sensory memory, that sort of fleeting thing. As I look at you here, it's just a few microseconds. Short-term memory, Miller tried to say that was 7 plus and minus 2. Actually, it's about 3 or 4. You will only hold 3 or 4 things in your mind at one time. This means it's almost impossible to teach anything very quickly. Remember that fact. And then long-term memory. If you don't shunt stuff from short to long-term memory, it's been a waste of time. It's all about recall. That's why multiple choice questions are a bit stupid in e-learning, because a doctor doesn't walk into a patient when they're operating on them and goes, right, is this a liver, a kidney, or a lung? Oh yeah, it's a kidney. It's not how the brain works. You have to know what it is. You have to recall it automatically and quickly from long-term memory. But we don't pay enough attention to that, which is why our examination systems are by and large tests of cramming in short-term memory with no space practice. You can pass those exams. We all have, I have, you have. It means nothing to me. When I come to employing people, I actually put all that stuff to one side because I know the game because I've played it. Then we have the unpacking of working memory. This is really interesting because it's a tricky thing, this little register, where you only remember 3 or 4 things, but you have to understand how it works. And then Badley comes along with episodic buffers, the phonological loop. This is complex but interesting stuff, and we should be paying attention to it. And then Tulving. How many people here know the difference between semantic and episodic memory, if I were to ask you? Okay, that's okay, actually. But I actually personally think that everyone who teaches should know that distinction. Really, you know, the fact that you might remember last night, episodic memory is a sort of, you know, I was at the party dancing wildly and you have that horrible recall in your mind of you dancing on the dance floor like a video. That's episodic memory. Semantic memory is really remembering words, phrases, maths, and so on, okay? It's the symbols that one might read through language. And what Tulving did discover, however, is that cues matter. When you're teaching kids, space practice, repeating things isn't enough. What you should be focusing on are the cues, the little things that, like handles on suitcases, allow the learners to pull the stuff out once it's in long-term memory. So that's how memory works. Great breakthrough, but how often do we focus on the cues that we want kids to remember, as opposed to just the stuff? Hardly ever. It's all about the stuff. And then we have Erickson and deliberate practice. Again, a guy who's been ignored largely, but he basically says, you won't learn jack without practicing it, without doing it. But we still get these kids for years on end, trundling in and out of lecture theatres, doing very little, unless it's some science subjects or medicine or whatever. But you really have to do stuff to remember it. Talent management. I hate talent management companies. It's not about talent, it's about practice. It's about hard work. You know? Did anybody here get a degree by just sitting around doing nothing and then just relying on their internal talent to get a degree in mathematics? I don't think so. We work bloody hard. It's all about practice. Okay? Then we have some stuff. If you're not in this sort of training world, you might not know many of these things, but they have influenced you, believe me. We have Mager, the guy who came up with learning objectives, very famous book. Boy, do I hate it when I get courses with learning objectives on the front. It bores me shitless. You know, e-learning manuals, the first thing you give an excited young kid who comes into the class, oh, I really want to know about physics or whatever, and the objectives of this lesson are, and they're falling asleep. You have to grab them by the throat in 2 seconds or you'll lose them. And we do the very opposite. We bore them. We bore them with trainer speak and teacher speak. It makes no sense. And then Gagne, he was the guy who actually put that learning objectives thing into a 9-step, and that's why it's all in every train the trainer and teacher training course. 50-year-old theory. Kolb, at least Kolb had an view of experiential learning, that experience matters. And then Bloom, even Bloom, Bloom's theory is 50 years old. There have been plenty of taxonomies since that have been better, but we're still obsessed by Bloom. I don't know why. I think we're in love with theories that are just 50 years old. It's my only explanation for this. But read the people who read the recent research. You know, get on Twitter. There are people who can help you with that stuff if you don't know much of it. Then, God, this is bad. The holists. We have a guy called Fleming who does no research, writes a book on VAK, vocational auditory and kinesthetic, and the whole world says, that's good, I'm going to get badges. My kids got badges in primary school. I have twin boys. One got a kinesthetic badge and another one a visual badge. A kinesthetic badge. I went apeshit. I went to the teacher and she hadn't a clue what this meant. She had been told to issue these badges. Now, one of my twins is a bit edgy, as lads are when they're 9 years old, almost universally. And just because they're a bit fidgety and they move around a bit does not mean they're kinesthetic learners. The very opposite. You should be calming them down and teaching them using all sorts of different modalities. Pigeonholing kids through learning styles is an evil. It stereotypes them, it does them no good whatsoever. In fact, it may do them a lot of harm. So you have to get that stuff out of your heads, or you're wasting people's lives. Honey and Mumford, that's the equivalent. There are about 70 learning styles theories. The Americans believe in a thing called done and done. It's all over the place. There's no real validation of this stuff. That's because they don't exist. Personality styles exist. People have personalities, but you don't have learning styles. And what we're confusing is personality type, extrovert, introvert, and so on, with learning styles. That's where the mistake comes, the category mistake. And then I'll say a word about Jay Cross, because he was a good friend of mine, and sadly he died this year. We had a service for him last night here in this conference. But a guy who opened my mind up to something that's really important, that most learning doesn't take place in schools and universities and college. The vast majority of learning takes place outside that context, in workplace, in the context of your family, in clubs you've joined, in sports you participate in informal learning. That's how we really learn. And of all the money in the world that's spent in education, how much money do we spend on that? Almost nothing. Almost all of the budget goes on formal courses and formal institutions when we know with absolute certainty, empirical certainty, that a huge amount of knowledge actually comes through other routes. That is awful. And Cross really taught me that. Okay? The go with the flow guy, I don't buy that one, but he has something there in terms of programming and stuff, but we can do it. Then the last one, Seligman. This again went all wrong. The Pied Piper of happiness. I don't want to hear the word happiness in any context, educational or training other words. I'm a happy guy, but I don't want somebody telling me I should be. Education is not about being a clown and training other people to be clowns. This happiness cake is all wrong. Again, it's a dysfunctional, deficit view of education, that people come in as not having enough happiness, not having enough virtues, and that we as teachers have to fill that bottle up. No, they come in as normal human beings just like you and me. You don't have that role. It's not your role to make people happy. That wasn't in the job description. Ignore those people who think we should be happy campers all the time. Some of the most worrying people in my life have been people who just laugh all the time. They become really annoying. Informal Learning by Jay Cross. I recommend you read that book. Then we have weird stuff here. Mr. Maslow. Mr. Maslow. What a waste of time. Still alive and kicking in every bloody training course in the world. It's a hopelessly inadequate and impoverished view of human nature, and it only works because it's a colored pyramid on PowerPoint. That's the only reason it survived. It's really, it's great that. Oh yeah, Maslow, yeah, well, I get that. Complete and utter bollocks. How many teachers have walked into a room with that pyramid in their mind and went, this is really going to help me teach these kids, 30 kids at a time, or a lecture hall of 300? None in the history of our species. It's a complete and utter waste of time and money. And you may think you know Maslow's theory, but what you may not know is that he actually abandoned the one that normally appears in courses for another pyramid up here that nobody's ever heard of. Okay? All right, we're getting here. Getting towards the end, guys. We have here the assessors. The Darth Vaders come into our universe and want to bloody test our kids until you may as well just string them up to perpetual test machines now. Our kids are getting tested at 3, 6, 9, blah, blah, Christ, you get tested forever. The big problem here was the type of testing originally, with I-Think's IQ. I'm not a big critic, because I think that type of thinking can be tested. I'm not against that. It's empirically verifiable, but it's only part of the story. Luckily, we had Gardner with multiple intelligences, but again, poorly validated. If you really look at Gardner's theory, it's suspiciously close to the school curriculum. That's all I'll say. Don't imagine that it matches the cognitive faculties that we really have. People really seriously involved in cognitive psychology don't have much time for Gardner's theories because it doesn't seem to match. Then we have Schleicher, Mr. Pisa, who came along and killed us stone dead with the Pisa rankings. That leaning tower of Pisa, and every stupid politician in the world, especially in my country, rushed off into the schools, started beating teachers over the heads and insisting that they teach maths until kids are almost dead with boredom. That's what happened, and that's what is happening in my country. The rest of the curriculum being abandoned in this rush towards maths and STEM subjects, when we know with certainty that the real needs out there are far from introverted maths professors. The last person I would go and get help in my life from would be I taught maths. I like maths. I'm not going to go to a professor of maths for many problems in my life. Okay? Myers-Briggs, Ponzi scheme. Two sisters, read Jung, have no background in psychology, write a little test, do something very clever. They sell a little certificate that says, if you know this test, you can sell it to other people. Suddenly, that's what we call a Ponzi scheme. And there are millions of people who will deliver Myers-Briggs tests. It has absolutely, actually, it picked up the wrong bits of Jung. It's not even Jungian in its basis. And this stuff's all over the place now. And this is serious because this affects people's jobs, careers, lives. People get jobs on the back of whether they have some of these attributes. How stupid is that? No science at all. Okay? Then we have Kirkpatrick. You might not know that if you're not in training. His 4 levels of evaluation, complete waste of time. Kirkpatrick was a lovely guy. He wrote his PhD thesis in this, had no idea what he was doing, but his son picked up on it, and suddenly they had a business, another Ponzi scheme. The reason you get happy or smile sheets at conferences is because of him. He thinks this is like good research. You know, the fact that you might have one of those sheets stuck to your backside when you come off it, there's no statistical validity to any of this stuff. And did you like the biscuits? I don't know, whatever they ask. You know, it doesn't tell you whether you learn anything, but it got stuck in the system, this 4-level system. Nobody ever gets to level 4 in results in Kirkpatrick because they're too busy transcribing the little pencil marks and boxes from the happy sheets. So they're stuck in the lower level of the pyramid. Okay? Then, these guys. I think this is interesting in education. We had a guy who I really admired, a philosopher called, sorry, my time's, I'll rush through this. We have educationalists, White, educationalist autonomy, Hattie, who really looked at empirical. Some of his stats was off, but really looked at stuff in detail to see what really worked in learning for teachers, and people are picking up on that. Black and Williams, feedback matters. If you want to know one word that will improve your teaching and learning technique, feedback, feedback, feedback. And then Dweck with the growth mindset. Now, I'm just going to end on these ones because this is where it gets really interesting. I think we've had more pedagogic change in the last 20 years than in the last 2,500 years, and it hasn't been because of teaching. All the pedagogic change I've seen over the last 20 years have come from technology and technologists. A bold thing to say, but I think that Berners-Lee gave us the World Wide Web, Gates gave us PowerPoint, you all use it. We have Page and Brin who gave us Google, a huge pedagogic shift. We have Jobs who gave us all those devices that were integrated. Chen and Hurley gave us YouTube, perhaps the greatest learning platform for vocational learning we've ever seen, for learning how to do things. Bezos gave us books. Zuckerberg is about to give us $30 billion. And if you read his letter yesterday, you'll see that he's going to spend a lot of that on personalized learning. Very interesting. And he also bought the Oculus Rift. You'll see VR coming in here. He wants to use that stuff to massively increase the use of technology in education. And then we have the online educationalist, Papert. I'm not a big fan of Papert. Social constructivists. You know, if we all just collaborate, everything will be well. Most of my experience in collaborative learning has been a complete and utter waste of time because 2 or 3 people around the table are bored. Boys especially are excluded because they get easily distracted. I'm not sure about the wisdom of that liberal orthodoxy. Sperling, who started the online universities. Guy and Prensky gave us all that game-based stuff. Games can be good in learning. Jimmy Wales, who got a Nobel Prize for starting Wikipedia, the greatest knowledge resource in the world. And where do I hear most negativity about it? At online learning conferences. From professional educators who say, I wouldn't recommend Wikipedia to my students. Oh, no, 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 no. I never make a mistake when I teach. I'm faultless. This is wrong. It doesn't matter. Your kids use it anyway. Okay, Dougie Mass with Moodle, Khan Academy on mathematics, Nig and Kohler with MOOCs. Again, why on earth are people so ridiculously critical about MOOCs? Waking up, guys. We've waited 20, 30 years for technology to deliver massive online education to people who didn't have access to it, and all we want to do is kill it. I hear that at this conference. This is awful. I think we need to grow up on this and say, this is a good thing, let's support it. Why are you paying to come to Online Educa if you don't like online learning? A banker would not go to a banking conference and say, I hate money. Okay, last one. Okay, this is a bit weird. I love it, Illich. Read Deschooling. Great, great book. Wrong, great book. Gatto, the most rewarded, perhaps the best teacher in the whole of the United States, taught in Harlem, taught black kids for years, for 30 years, walked out one day, said, I've had enough of this. I know what this game is. It's a political game where I'm teaching this mosaic of subjects. Kids get up every hour on a bell. The Prussian system came from Germany originally. They march off to another room, sit down, do another dislocated subject. This weird fragmented stuff we deliver to kids is all wrong. He knew it was wrong. And he said, I'm out here, and then started writing books on the subject. I really recommend that you read his books. Imagine if I, running a company, said, okay, it's time to get your salary. you've all got to march down to the finance department. They all go crazy. Are you crazy? But that's what we do to kids in schools. And then we have Harris, love her, Judith Harris. If you're a parent, read her book, Peer Groups Matter. Teachers and adults don't in terms of forming the character. Peer groups matter. Every parent who's had a kid knows, oh wow, this has hit me. They don't listen to a word I say. You're damn right they don't. And Judith tells you why. And then some horrific stuff here, Mitra's hole in the wall and Soli stuff. I just have no time for this. Came right out of Rousseau. It's imaginative nonsense. It didn't work. I went to see a hole in the wall project in Africa. The teachers told me they wouldn't have it again if it were free. They despised it. The parents didn't like it. The kids thought it was nonsense. It was mostly boys playing games. And Mitra is bad news for our business. Less so with Ken Robinson, but be careful with this creativity kick, you know. Let's be creative in it. What does that mean? If you're going to play that card, then tell me what you mean by creativity. Because most of the time I don't buy the answers I hear. It just means, can I do what I want in the classroom? No, you can't. Because all this bad stuff is there, and we need some good evidence-based practice. And then lastly, Thiel, big critique of higher education. I will end there. I hope it's been a whistle-stop tour. I've just got a couple of minutes over time, but hopefully you've picked up a few names amongst all that cognitive overload and forgetting. Some things will strike you, you'll walk away, pick them up, look them up on Wikipedia even. But anybody who wants the book, I've written really full articles on every one of these people over a period of almost 20 years. It's about 90,000 words. I'll send you that for free as a PDF. Read it and criticize it. You know, give me a critique. I'm not getting everything right. My views may be way off in some things. I'm happy with that. I want to learn. I'm happy to change my mind. But thank you very much for listening.